Hi, everybody. I'm Mindy Coolidge. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the co-lead of the Port's LGBTQx and Friends Employee Resource Group.
Hello, everybody. My name is Aaron Ray. I use he, him pronouns. And with Mindy, I am the other co-lead of our employee resource group. And we'd like to welcome everybody.
So, Aaron, why is an inclusive workplace important?
I think we can all agree that creating an environment where people can bring their authentic selves to work is essential. Think about how much of our life we spend at work. Think about how much of ourselves we bring to our teams. It makes good business sense to enable people to be their authentic selves. It increases satisfaction, it improves collaboration, and in long term, it increases employee retention.
So, Aaron, what makes inclusion at PDX unique?
Well, at PDX, part of our mission, a big part of our mission, is connecting people with the world. So we need to understand and acknowledge the needs of everyone that we serve, including the travelers who come through the airport. If we're inclusive, then we're meeting our customers where they are and we're giving them a welcoming place to be. And when you think about it, that's really what PDX people are all about.
Well, we are thrilled to introduce Chuck Bernsohn, who is an accessibility consultant and an advocate for the LGBTQx community and the chronic illness community. They have provided trainings and consultancy for the port, most notably recently when we opened the rental car center. Chuck worked with our change ambassadors as they were unveiling our first ever gender inclusive restrooms in the RCC building. Chuck is here today to give us a crash course on gender inclusivity in customer service. Without further ado, Chuck.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction, Mindy. I am very happy to be here with you all today, and it has been such a pleasure working with the port so far. I have had a lot of personal experience of discomfort in airports, and it is so happy making for me that I know that you are all doing this work and are committed to creating an environment where employees and customers feel really safe and affirmed in the Portland airport. So thank you for taking the time to join us today. A bit about me. Mindy introduced me. Thank you again for that. And I want to just share that I do this work both with organizations and companies and also with families and therapists. Gender is a really deeply personal identity and one that we all experience in very different ways. And so I am so happy always to be able to help facilitate the creation of more easeful and safe spaces for people across the gender spectrum. A bit of my own experience in airports that I'll share more of as we go through. Airports, as a trans and non-binary person, are a really difficult space to navigate. You have many moments where you have to show your ID, and for many of us, myself included, the marker for our gender on our ID don't necessarily match our held gender identity. There's scans and body pats and public restrooms. There's a lot of reinforcing of the gender binary that happens in public spaces in general, but really specifically in airports. So I'm so excited to have an opportunity to work with you all to see how we can really shift some of the pain and discomfort that gender expansive people experience at the airport. So I will go through a good number of terms here. And again, I hope that some of these sound familiar to you and that we can reinforce some of those terms for you today. And perhaps some of these will be new for you. I think they're really essential terms for talking to people in your life about gender, and also to make sure that when I'm going through the rest of my talk, I'm really sure you are understanding how and why I'm using these terms. So the first distinction I want to be sure to make is between sex and gender. Sex are the biological characteristics of hormones, chromosomes, reproductive organs, secondary sex characteristics like facial hair, etc., that we have been taught are two very clean buckets, right, of male and female. I'll get into it in a moment how it's much more complicated than that. But gender, on the other hand, is the meaning that we ascribe to those characteristics. It's the meaning that we ascribe to maleness and femaleness, to certain body parts, to certain voices, etc. Gender is also a place in which people can perform, right, their own identity internally and their relationship to those sex characteristics. That comes out in the clothes people choose to wear, how they choose to cut their hair, makeup, jewelry, all of that fun stuff are ways that we express our gender to the world. Trans and cis, you'll hear me say transgender and cisgender, or just trans people and cis people. Either is perfectly wonderful. Transgender people are simply people who do not identify with the gender assignment they were given at birth, right? Somebody was born, a doctor looked at their body and said, this person is a male or a female. And there were a lot of gender norms, right, that were then ascribed to those two sex buckets of different sex characteristics. Cisgender people, on the other hand, are simply people who identify with that assignment. They were perhaps assigned female at birth, and they identify as a girl. They feel good with a lot of the social norms of being a girl. They identify with media representations of girls, etc. Intersex people are people who are born with biological traits that cannot be cleanly categorized into male or female. We can see that spectrum of sex characteristics outside of intersex people as well. For instance, there are people who were assigned female at birth, who identify as female, who are not intersex, who naturally grow facial hair. And we need to make sure that we're building systems of protection for everybody in that gender and sex binary. Gender expression and gender identity are two terms that I often see conflated, and I think the distinction is very important. So gender identity is your internal understanding of your gender. It's the meaning you put, perhaps, on the sex characteristics you have. It's the way that you feel internally about your gender. Gender expression, on the other hand, is the way that you present your gender to the world. And for many reasons, these two don't always align, right? For instance, in terms of safety, there's many people who don't feel safe enough to fully express their gender. There are also people whose understanding of their gender shifts day to day, and their expression will shift right along with that identity shift. And it can make it very difficult then to look at somebody and know what their gender identity is. And for most of us, we're taught from a very, very young age that you can look at somebody and you can know their gender and you can know the words that they identify with. And I really want to encourage you to focus on the moments you're doing this throughout your day, to see the moments in which you're looking at a stranger and saying, that's a woman or that's a man. And think about why you're doing that. Is it the way they're dressed? Is it the sound of their voice? Is it the job that they're in, etc.? So this distinction will be really relevant as we move forward throughout this conversation. Pronouns, as many of us learned when we were in English class growing up, are terms that we sub in for nouns. She, he, they, it, etc. They make English run much smoother, and many languages throughout the world use pronouns in order to reduce the number of times you're saying the same noun over and over again. As Mindy and Aaron both beautifully demonstrated before, pronouns are a representation, perhaps, of someone's gender identity. And you cannot look at somebody and know their pronouns, just as you cannot look at someone and know their gender identity. So a best practice here I really want to encourage is anytime someone needs to know your name, assume they also need to know your pronoun. And this can be as simple as adding your pronouns to your badge at work, if that is allowable in the department you're in. It can be saying them verbally, like Mindy and Aaron did, introducing themselves. And it can be in written communication, in your email, etc. But really normalizing that for yourself can make it easier and safer for the people around you to be clear with you about what their pronouns are as well. Finally, two terms that you will hear me use throughout the rest of our time together, degender and misgender. I'm going to talk about degendering specifically in terms of language. So to degender your language is to remove gendered terminology. It is to say to a group of people, perhaps, hello, you all, instead of hello, ladies. It's taking away those binary terms that we're so used to using day to day. Misgendering is a term that I have struggled to explain to people who have never experienced it. What I will say is it is experience of not being seen. Misgendering is simply identifying somebody as a gender they do not identify with. So that can be calling somebody a man or a woman who does not identify as such, or it can be using the incorrect pronoun for somebody. Misgendering is a deeply painful experience in my experience, and I encourage you to look for other voices in the trans and gender expansive community on social media, and there's amazing books that exist now to get a better sense of what this experience feels like if you're not someone who has experienced it yourself. The social construction of gender. So this is something that I think is important as a groundwork before we dive into any best practices, to get on the same page about the ways in which our norms and expectations of gender are really shaped by the society in which we live. So this social norms of gender, right? The social creation of gender is a bit of an abstract term. So I wanted to really visualize it for you all. Our understanding of gender is shaped by so many things around us. And it's really shaped from the moment we come into the world, right? We get that assignment instantly. And all of you who have children know, right? The second question anybody asks you after they ask you your child's name when they're first born is what their gender is. And that assignment really shapes the messaging we get in our internal family structures, from our friends, in the school systems, at work. It is the expectations put on us. It shapes what emotions we're allowed to express safely. It shapes what jobs we think we're allowed to have. It shapes what sort of authority we're allowed to take. And all of this messaging is coming at us all day long. And I say this in part so that you can start to pay attention to it in your day-to-day life, but also so you can get a little glimpse into how much messaging trans and gender expansive people are getting that are challenging their gender experience and reinforcing that gender binary. Two big points I want to highlight on here are geography and time. Where you are born and when you are born deeply shapes the ways in which your gender is allowed to be expressed and the expectations put on you about your gender. We know that throughout time and continuing to this day, Indigenous communities throughout the world have had a multitude of gender identity markers. Rarely are there simply male and female categories. And I say this because for many of you, this might feel like something very new, sort of coming out of left field. I want to acknowledge that these ideas of gender expansiveness have really existed for a very long time and continue to exist throughout the world. I also want to highlight geography because what it means to be a woman in perhaps New York City in the country looks very different than what it looks like to be a woman in Pakistan or Nigeria or France, right? The cultural expectations of how you present, what clothes you wear, what you do with your body hair, what you do with your makeup, looks very different from place to place and from time to time. I say all of this in large part to help you remember when you are challenging yourself to think more expansively about gender, to remember that you were taught what gender means, and the person next to you was taught perhaps a very different idea of what gender means. You, for example, might think that the norm is for men to never wear skirts, right? In the culture you were raised in, that was the cultural expectation and the cultural norm. The person standing next to you might come from a culture in which skirts were worn by everybody growing up, and that is perfectly normal to them to see in a public space. I also want to say all of this to again reiterate this idea that because we all have different notions of what gender means and looks like, You cannot look at somebody and know their gender identity. You cannot look at somebody and know their pronouns. And you cannot look at somebody and know whether they want you to refer to them with one gender marker or another. Let's jump into a few best practices for addressing gender expansiveness at the airport and in your internal teams. I so wish I had like a 3-point easy guide to give you of every situation. Unfortunately, it's much more nuanced than that. As you maybe have picked up on, right? Gender is a deeply complicated and deeply personal identity. I'm going to give you a few suggestions, and I hope that you will take these and to both work, but also into your personal life, and to see the moments in which you can help people of all genders feel more affirmed and celebrated in your life. I also just want to highlight before we jump into these that while certainly trans people, non-binary people, gender expansive people are the focus of today's talk, look at the people in your life, look at yourself, and see the ways that people across the board, cisgender and otherwise, do not fall cleanly into these categories of male and female. The way people choose to dress, the voice people have, the facial hair people have, the roles that people have, all of these pieces, all of that messaging we're getting about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, for most people is more complicated than that. The biggest piece that I want to encourage you to use, and I think this is especially important when working with customers at the airport, is to degender your language. To write that term again, to take the gendered terminology out of your day-to-day language. And I encourage you to pay attention today or throughout the week as you're going about your day. How often do you sub in a gendered term, right? And that could be identifying somebody as a man or a woman. That could be addressing a group, right? Using ladies or guys or some of these other gendered terms we use all the time in English. And think about what terms you could sub in, right? Think about whether or not that term is actually giving you any more information about that person. Right? What changes if you say, right, there's a person walking across the street with their kid, versus saying there's a woman walking across the street with her daughter, right? Is there more information or less information that you're conveying? This is also a really important step to take when you're dealing with customers. Again, to say hello, ladies, to a group of people does not actually convey any different information than just saying hello, right? And what you might be doing in that moment is misgendering someone in that group and creating a small fissure in their sense of safety in that space and in their sense of connection to you, right? We're much more likely to be honest and connected to people who we feel seen by, right? I think in the introduction, right, we talked about that a little bit, right? Bringing your full self to work and bringing your full self to relationships in public, right? In customer service, especially. Being able to feel seen by the person you're talking to will allow for much more honest and direct communication. Really taking a moment to look at the times in which your gendered options are not optional. I'll get into an example in a moment. And really taking the time to explain, whether it's to your coworker, your employee, or a customer, why you can't avoid asking for that gendered information. One of the examples that came to mind as I was working on this, I cannot tell you how long I've spent like this in an airport, standing in a scanner. For those of you who work security, you know, right? There are two buttons on those beautiful scanners. There's a male and female button. And for people like me who throughout my life, long before I identified as trans and knew I was trans, have presentations of gender that are difficult for people to categorize specifically into male or female, it's really difficult to navigate security. And so something I really encourage you to do with that specific example, if you're unsure of which button to push, I promise you it is not the first time that person has had that issue in the airport, and certainly not the first time they've been challenged in their gender presentation in public spaces. Simply poke your head in and say, I'm sorry to ask, I have only a male or female button I have to press. Can you tell me which option to select in order to get the most accurate read? There is a lot you can do to create a sense of trust and security just through acknowledging these moments in which we have to ask for gendered information from people who are perhaps difficult to categorize into these buckets we've been told are very clear and clean. Making mistakes. One of the best practices I always like to talk about in my trainings is how to fail. I call it failing gracefully because there is an inevitability to making mistakes when you are doing equity work. If we're doing equity work well, we are centering the voices of people who are most marginalized and oppressed by society. And people's needs shift. So in order to stay up to date with equity work, in order to do this work well, we have to be willing to make mistakes and we have to be willing to learn from those mistakes. The first step is simply getting comfortable with the idea of making mistakes. And that I know from experience is not a light switch we can flip. It takes months, if not years, of work. But part of what helps me deal with mistakes that I make is knowing that I'm not going to learn if I'm spiraling into shame. From a neuropsych perspective, our brains basically shut down when we're experiencing shame. So if you, for example, misgender somebody and you instantly say, oh, I'm a horrible person, I'm terrible, I know I've been working on this, but I just keep messing it up, right? You're locked in shame. Taking a moment to take a deep breath and saying, there's that mistake I knew was coming, can launch you out of that place of shame and can give you the opportunity to actually learn from that mistake and to make a different mistake next time. Another big piece of this is acknowledging that impact and intent don't always align, often don't align, unfortunately. Right? Any mistake you've made, you did not intend to make, right? It happens all the time, especially when we're communicating with others. And this is important to acknowledge both because it can help you shift away from shame, but also because we need to really be focusing on the impact, right? If you misgender a customer, for example, while you're working, while you may have had the best intentions to not do that, they're still experiencing pain or discomfort because of that misgendering. And what matters in that moment is creating a space for them to recover from that and feel safe again. And then for you to take that intention back with you to doing the work to making a different mistake next time, to make new mistakes is what I encourage you to do. This vein, it's really important to remember that when someone is correcting you, they're giving you a gift. It can feel like you're in trouble, but what that person is actually saying to you is, I care enough about myself and I care enough about my connection to you to correct you and to make sure that you're seeing me for my full self. Finally, this is something that will most likely be more useful to your internal co-working experience than perhaps those brief customer-facing moments you have. But here are some steps I really encourage you to take when it comes to making mistakes, right? How do we recover then from those mistakes? Number one, very well could be useful with a customer, right? If you misgender somebody, if you use somebody's incorrect name, pronoun, etc., be really specific in your apology, right? Think for a moment to a time in your life, right, when someone has said, "Oh, I'm sorry" to you, right? Was it more impactful for them to say, "I'm sorry," or for them to say, "I'm sorry for X," right? Be as specific as you can be. "I'm sorry for misgendering you." Take responsibility, right? This is not a good moment to say, "Oh, I'm really trying, and I've got an old brain, and I'm working on it," right? You made a mistake. Nothing wrong with it. We all do it, but it's important to acknowledge that harm has been incurred on the other end of that mistake. This is then a wonderful moment to express some appreciation for that gift someone gave you. And this is not specific to misgendering, right? This is sort of across the board. If somebody, gives you feedback about a way that you are interacting that does not feel good to them, thank them for that, because they're showing you they have an investment in your connection and in your relationship. And then finally, reinforcing that idea of centering impact and not intent, right? The worst kind of an apology is, I didn't mean to, right? We don't mean to make mistakes, but the pain and harm is still real and there. Asking what that person needs from you can be a wonderful step to take in repairing that relationship and to repair that person's sense of safety and security in the workplace or in the airport. And what that person might need from you may be space. And that, again, is not punishment. That's them taking the time they need to feel safe and secure. And hopefully they will come back to that relationship renewed, and you will then have the space to do the work you need to do to make sure that you are not misgendering that person the next time you see them. That is all we have for today, this brief time together. I thank you all so much for investing your energy and time in this really, really vital work. And I just want to express personal appreciation for the safety that you are helping to foster at the Portland Airport.